Very good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are tuning from. Welcome to ACFIM Talks, our second edition in the year 2022. It's glad to be back. Happy New Year. I've not been in touch with many of you, but it's very amazing to be back with you. And thank you again for joining us on ACFIM Talks today as we discuss the deficits in Uganda's education sector. Your host, moderator as usual, is Felix Kafuma, and I am joined by two distinguished guests. They're familiar on your screen sets, but before I introduce them, allow me to invite everybody to grab a cup of coffee and subscribe to our social media platforms on our Facebook ACFIM, and then also our YouTube account, ACFIM, and our Twitter at ACFIM UG, so that you can be able to get those notifications, and you can also follow us on those media platforms and be part of the conversation. Once again, thank you so much for always making it a day to be part of this discussion. ACFIM Talks. Today with me, I have two distinguished guests that I'm going to be introducing, starting with the only doctor we have for today's show, Dr. Denis Musinguzi, who is a senior lecturer at Uganda Martyrs University, and he has served as the head of Department of Governance, Peace and International Studies. He was a dean at School of Arts and Social Sciences at Uganda Martyrs University. He has also served as a consultant for local and international organizations for more than 10 years. He has specialized in the areas of governance, management, public policy, human rights, and development. Doctor, you're most welcome to this show. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much.
Doctor, are you there?
Here.
Great.
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Doctor is joining us.
Yeah.
I can hear you very well. Doctor is joining us for the second time, and is almost becoming a regular of this show. And allow me also to introduce to you Eddie Kayinda. Eddie is one of us here. He's an expert on research, public admin management, and he's also an expert on economy. He's economy that works. Let me put it that way. He's an economist and also a teacher. He has consulted widely on people, poverty, governance, and development with government of Uganda, civil society, and bilateral development partners. He's also a scholar, and he has a master's of arts degree in public admin and bachelor of arts in economics and postgraduate from the prestigious University of Makerere University. Eddie Kayinda, you're most welcome to the show.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Great, and let us get this off the ground. For many of you that have been following the events, I think it was on 10th when government of Uganda reopened schools after close to 2 years of lockdown, ending the world's longest lockdown of schools. So Uganda, we have that record. In fact, to be exact, it is 1 year, 9 months, and 5 days when schools were officially opened. And it is estimated that 15 million learners were expected to return to school. We'll revisit those figures to see where we are and what probably are the current numbers, because there have been reports that in a number of districts the turn-up was really, really low. So we shall have a discussion around those numbers. But it's also important for us to appreciate that when the schools reopened on 10th, amidst the challenges that have been envisaged, and following the president of Uganda's announcement towards the end of last year that schools were to reopen, it was very clear that the context of the environment had changed. We had young mothers, we had pregnant young persons that were equally encouraged to join school, whereas some abandoned, but there was a clarion call by government encouraging our young mothers, encouraging the pregnant girls to join school when school opens. And since then, we've had also a debates and discussion around the readiness accommodating pregnant mothers, pregnant young girls in school. And again, we shall also have a discussion in that direction. But also, it's important for us to appreciate that several government-aided schools have since then been reported in media to be in a sorry state. Yet government diverted approximately 62 billion Uganda shillings towards renovation of government-aided schools. What we've been seeing, some of the schools are not in the state to accommodate classes, to accommodate learners. They're in a very sorry state. We've also had cases where a number of teachers have not reported back to their profession, on top of a number of school-going children not reporting back to school. So, but the bigger question or the bigger elephant in the room that I think will inform our discussion for today is how government has managed the process and whether we are really ready or whether we were really ready for this, because it didn't just happen. We knew at some point that schools had to reopen, and who is to be held responsible for whatever is not going right. And also, where do we go from here, and how do we rectify some of these things we are seeing that that tend to speak so much about our planning when it comes to managing the education sector, especially after 2 years of abeyance. So let me start with Doctor. When you look at the state of our education after this long period of layoff, as a country, were we really ready to reopen?
Thank you so much, Felix, and my colleague, Eddie. I should say I had the opportunity of going to School of Education in Makerere University for a postgraduate diploma in education, and Eddie was my classmate. I'm glad that we are here speaking about issues of education. And as people have said, you know, education is a right, but it is also a capacity kind of right, which enables us to do so many other things when we have gotten out of education. Now you're asking, were we ready to open for education? I think we closed too much. That should be the starting point. Opened earlier. Whether we are ready or not, the government, and in particular the Ministry of Education, had told us they had done a lot of work, a lot of inspection, and were informed that indeed we were ready to open the schools. But on the opening day, the mainstream media did us a good job. They visited so many schools, and the pictures that they were showing were actually appalling as far as our readiness are concerned. There were schools, government schools, which were being still occupied by people who had been displaced by the natural disasters. They are in schools. It is a day to the opening, and people are there. So while we had been told that we had been ready, then you realized from the reports that we got on television that we were far from being ready in terms of, you know, cleaning of the schools, putting in place the requirements, and making all the people ready for the resumption of school. But given that this came after 2 years of opening, after 2 years of closure, we had to open anyway. And I hope as we open, things are going to improve, Felix.
Wow, thank you for that. Eddie, let me come to you. Eddie, you're a proprietor. You own and run a school. And I think your experience is going to help to enrich this discussion. From experience, because I saw, for example, in media, I could see some schools having ant hills that are trying to clean. Some schools were habitats for animals. So on day one, you would see some of the schools, they were transferring animals from their temporary lodges, which were classroom blocks, to other places. I mean, there were very, very, very interesting cases here. Were we really ready?
Thank you, Felix. Readiness to open schools, I would say, was based on information provided by government that Uganda was ready to open schools. Like you mentioned, I'm a proprietor of a school, and the COVID task force in charge of education instructed all inspectors of schools to go and inspect schools and make a report that schools were ready to receive students, children in schools. And I can assure you, one of my school was one of the schools inspected by the inspectors, just like private government schools and public schools around my community were inspected by the inspectors. But those are the same schools which you say have anthills, were habitats for animals, and people who were bypassers had opted to stay in those schools as homes, right? But to my dismay, the inspectors of schools gave a rosy picture that schools were ready, schools were clean, schools were everything. They were ready to implement COVID SOPs and everything, and they presented that that report to the Ministry of Education. The task force had a duty to delegate. I mean to submit that report to the president, and the president, based on that information, to open schools. But for me, I think these persons, these inspectors of schools, should be imprisoned for providing the president wrong information. That's the first thing. Secondly, I know constitutionally you're not supposed to provide information to the president that is not related in relation to what is expected. For me, that was the most misgiving factor about opening of schools. Secondly, public schools, teachers in public schools have continuously gotten their salary. For the last 20 months, schools were closed, or 2 years, schools were closed. Head teachers were being paid public money. They collected their salaries from banks for all that time, but they did not have the courtesy of at least using some of the local resources, or even within the community, to ensure that schools are clean, desks are proper, books are okay. I can assure you, I visited some of these schools and books were eaten by termites. Desks were broken to the extent that some of the desks were collected by communities to go and use them as firewood in their kitchens. So when you talk about readiness to open schools, for me, I don't think we had the urge of ensuring the schools should be open, but we're not ready to open the schools. What the government ought to do, needed to do, was in somewhere around November, October last year, they should have had a clear assessment of these schools and provided some funding to ensure that the schools are physically upright, the teachers are trained and resourced to ensure that we can have a functional education system. And in the private sector, before I get back to you, some of us used our small monies to ensure that we create an open learning environment for the kids. But we also expected that as major contributors to the education sector, that is contributing almost over 50% of the national resource in the education sector, government needed to come out to our support to ensure that we open. I can assure you, some schools have not opened. The clear one, you know, like East High, kids came back, reported for 1 day, and they were told, kindly, please go back. We are not ready to receive you. And parents had already paid money, but they were refunded. That's the good thing. There are many other similar cases like that, just because government did not put in place a proper plan to reopen schools. Back to Felix.
Wow, thank you so much. I was looking at some of my gallery. There was that school that was posted from the West. That I think it was a former school. It was in a very shambolic state. And when you talk about the president receiving reports that encourage, remember the president first came in November to prepare Ugandans that there will be a school reopening. Then they re-echoed the same concerns around December. So we had all this time, although the months before, a lot of emphasis had been put on vaccination, especially for teachers. But schools are reopened, and then you see ugly scenes of structures. I mean, that structure is still in my head. Structures that even a cow can decide not to reside there because they were too bad. But those were classrooms. Now, the question I'm asking here, you talk about inspectors. They came, they inspected, and they passed structures fit for learning. Who should be held responsible in this case? Looking at the gaps we are discussing now, the state of the structures, the readiness of the schools to be able to provide learning, who should be held responsible for this mess? Let me start with you, Doctor.
Clear. We have the ministry in charge of education. We have state ministers, some for higher education, others for primary education. They hold the primary responsibility of ensuring that their sector is clean. As we are talking about inspectors, we have inspectors of education of schools within the local government structures. Up to the ground, we have school management committees within the communities. So the structures are very clear. To the extent that we are given that kind of law deal, I think the Ministry of Education, to be honest, they should acknowledge with regret and shame that they have betrayed Uganda as far as the reopening of schools are concerned. And as you're saying, there were monies that were allocated to ensure that when we get out of COVID, we are able to get back to schools in the normal way of schools operating. But as it has always been a complaint, when COVID came in, it seems much of the attention shifted from, the normal sector running of different sectors to focusing on education. And I think education experts, they forgot classroom blocks should be in place, the book should be in place, teachers should be, well prepared. They were only thinking about standard operating procedures. Do we have sanitary and water for bathing? Do we have to test? It's like the attention came to the management of COVID, and they kind of did not pay much attention to the other normal requirements of running of the school. And they should acknowledge that, no, things should have been done a lot better than the way we've done, in spite of the disruptions that were brought in by COVID. Things should have been better.
Wow. Eddie, you did share that your school, for instance, was inspected. But we are seeing some schools that were inspected and passed fit, yet with all due respect, they were not, and they are not fit for learning. So should we, the Directorate of Education Standards, because I know that body is holds the mandate of ensuring that our education, this infrastructure fulfills the minimum requirements. Did they go to sleep on job?
Felix, with due honesty, I want to strongly advise the Directorate of Education Standards to keep in touch with the realities of the constituency they are in charge of. First of all, and I'm an education entrepreneur, and I'm giving you first-hand information. The inspectors of schools have made this or made that period a D-day for them. Whether you qualify to have all the SOPs and the standards of a normal school that is reopening, whether you have the facilities or not, you needed to pay to acquire that certification to allow you to open. And
how much
the minimum was 200,000 shillings per school. For example, the minimum, but of course the maximum was endless. You can imagine in my community, we have over maybe 30 private schools and maybe another 10 public schools. If the inspectors were collecting that money per school, how much they would go with. But for me, that is not the issue. The issue is between you and I and doctor, we know what a functional school should be. Whereas they put emphasis on standard operating procedures, they did not put emphasis on majorly 5 things. 1, to ensure that the teachers are at school. Remember that some of the schools have opened without teachers. 2, to ensure that the classrooms are sufficiently cleaned and they're talking. When I talk about a talking classroom, a doctor knows what I'm trying to talk about. When you go in a primary setting, for example, that the classroom must teach a child without even the teacher entering the school, the class, right? When that day when the inspector came, phoned me at school with my teachers, trying to ensure that the classroom talks. And he was asking me a few questions, and my response was like, you are focusing on small things, on whether we are going to have social distancing or not. First of all, the kids are not even here. I would have expected you to speak about, are the teachers at school? Are the classrooms sufficient? Do you have water at school? Do you have textbooks? Are we ready that the schools can really open and provide sufficient good learning environment for the children? Those are the key issues. Do we have schemes of work? Do we have lesson plans? Have we conceptualized have the teachers been trained to use the abridged curriculum? Because you know the National Council the National Curriculum Development Center has given us an abridged curriculum that we should be using for this year. But I can assure you, schools are still using the old curriculum because they're not even aware that a new curriculum has been provided. So these are the key issues that constitute an education system within a school setting that the inspectors should have focused on focused on eating and rooting from the small monies that we do have as private sector institutions for self-enrichment. And I'm really disappointed by these guys. I don't know, in the strongest terms, I condemn this. And like Doctor mentioned, the Ministry of Education should come up to make an internal review and come to apologize to us for stealing from us. Thank you, Felix.
Those are the sentiments of a proprietor who is a victim of the inefficiencies of the system. Anyway, I think I can relate with what you're saying. I think in Uganda we have a knack of taking advantage of situations to rip off. Let me shift this a bit, something still related, but a bit off now. The blame game of the education standards. And I'm looking at now the new emerging narrative, not the narrative as per se, but the new emerging debate around allowing pregnant young girls to report and continue with school. And I can understand where the education ministry is coming from, and I really applaud it for that, from that perspective. But I think the debate now is shifting to whether, again, we are ready. Remember, we are discussing the readiness to reopen, but now whether we are ready to open and accommodate pregnant young girls and also accommodate young mothers in this learning setting without necessarily looking at the infrastructure, but also looking at the entire learning environment, whether the thought to allow young mothers, to allow pregnant young girls report to school, when it was hatched, debated, and passed, took into consideration the implications to ensure that those persons are now in a special category to be supported to learn. So I'm coming to you, Doctor. And I want you to weigh in on that matter, because how prepared were we, or how prepared are we to now confront a new challenge of accommodating young mothers, but also accommodating pregnant young girls to study?
Yes, Felix, there has been that very, very heated debate in the public about the subject. Should we open schools for pregnant mothers, for pregnant girls? Mainly we are talking about minors, and statistics are saying, you know, from 10 to around 19 who are becoming pregnant it means 64% between 15 and 19 have already become pregnant. So the debate has been, do we open, school for such kinds of categories? Children who have recently given birth and they are breastfeeding. Unfortunately, again, going back to the Minister of Education, I have seen guidelines for the prevention and management of teenage pregnancies released by the Ministry of Education. The revised guidelines were as recent as 2020. And when you go to the guidelines, Felix, the guidelines are very clear. When children become pregnant at school and they have been discovered, they should be counseled and their parents informed and also undergo counseling. But at 3 months, they should go for mandatory maternity leave, meaning they move out of school. These are the guidelines. And they give birth, breastfeed for 6 months, and after 6 months is when they should be readmitted. Unfortunately, neither the Ministry of Education nor the officials from the ministry have given this perspective. I don't know whether they are doing it deliberately or whether it is because of lack of communication skills. Felix, you've seen pictures of young girls heavily pregnant, 7, 8 months, carrying bags, going to school. The guidelines are not telling us about that. As you are saying, when someone is pregnant, they are psychologically tortured. Are the children themselves ready to go to school? Are they ready to remain in school? And in case of emergencies, who is responsible? When we talk about antenatal care, how should it be handled? So the Ministry of Education is creating a wrong impression that, pregnant, whether 5, 6, 7 months, they should go to school. They are making a wrong impression that when you are having a child, whether 1, 2, 3 months, you should also go back to school. And I'm wondering why they are not going according to their own guidelines, where at 3 months, a child is supposed to go for maternity leave, produce, and go back to school after 6 months. I think if the narrative was like that, we would be having a more productive kind of conversation. But the impression which is wrongly created is that every pregnant girl should go to school. If they are in boarding school, where should they be staying? Should they stay in the dormitories? Do we have separate houses? If there is an emergency, do we have the capacity? Do the schools have the capacity? The guidelines are talking about the support systems. We are supposed to have at the national level a national coordinating team. Does that team exist? Has it visited schools? At the district level, we are supposed to have a district health committee team, which is supposed to be doing that. At the school level, we are supposed to have health teams, school health teams. Have these teams been constituted? Are they capacitated? Are they operational? They are not. So when the Ministry of Education communicates that schools should open, for pregnant mothers and for breastfeeding children without bringing this kind of perspective, then I'm wondering, is there a hidden motive? Is there some kind of pressure? We all agree education is a right and it empowers people who receive education. But we should have a supportive environment of enabling that right. That's why we talk about rights and obligations. Now, when the duty bearers have not fulfilled their obligation to say that schools should open, it is to demand for the impossible. The schools are simply not ready. And for me, I would advise, let us stick to the guidelines the way they exist. And I've already talked about the guidelines. After 3 months, get out of school. Do the antenatal care, deliver safely. Breastfeed for 6 months. After 6 months, then be readmitted to school. If the conversation was like that, I don't think we would be having much of the disagreement. Felix.
Wow. You remind me of, it's called a drunkard's promise. You know, when a drunkard makes a promise, the following morning he doesn't remember what he promised. So we have guidelines. The ministry is deliberately forgetting to reconcile with their new drive of encouraging every pregnant and young mother to be in school. Eddie,
Felix, you
do
should.
you have cases?
Mm.
Yes, Eddie, you saying something?
Yes, I was going to ask that did the Ministry of Education conduct a survey and these mothers told them they want to go back to school in the first place?
But then I'm coming to you on that one because I want you to weigh in. I want you to weigh in on what the doctors just shared. But as you weigh in, first I want to find out: do you have cases of young mothers or cases of pregnant young girls who have reported to school, and how are you handling them?
I was in the community yesterday. I met two girls. One was she was before COVID-19. She was in primary 4, and now she's working in a salon. You can imagine a 13-year-old working in a salon environment and what happens in the salons. You know what happens there. But I also had one who has delivered a young mother in a nearby community. And I was asking her, do you really feel like you want to go back to school? And he's mentioning, you know, I cannot leave home. I cannot leave my child. I think the child is too young to be left at home. I probably maybe after 1 year or 2 years, when the child has started walking or talking, I can now leave the child and go back to school. That's why I was posting a question that, are you sure that these children want to go back to school when they're either mothers or pregnant? Secondly, between you and I, you know how curious kids can be in a school setting. They ask questions. Why is this person having a big stomach and have a small one? What explains this behavior? What could you have eaten? And and I'm telling you that
speaking.
Exactly. Why is this person spitting? I'm telling you, I have dealt with children and they can ask you questions, and you as a teacher, you don't even have an answer other than first go and Google. How can I respond? How can I respond to such a question? And it is not practically possible to have a mix of these children that are like this with children that are normal, are not pregnant, and are healthy, among others. Secondly, just like when we're in the School of Education, we learned about special needs education. These kind of category are special needs children, and they needed to have, government should have needed to have a policy or a guideline that is in place to handle such kind of kids. Probably for me, I would think, first of all, they could have taken stock. When the ministry says that they want these children to go back to school, they don't even know how many they are. Have they, through the Ministry of Education and inspectors of schools, went to communities and probably through the local system establish how many kids we are learning that are now mothers or pregnant? What best approaches could we have taken to ensure that they are counseled to remain in the state that they are in, but later on they can go back to school? What best approaches could we design probably a learning model, a remote learning model, a distance learning model that keeps them within a school setting without mixing them with others? We have private sector institutions, but also have non-state actors that would have taken on that role, because some of us are willing to do that. But because the ministry is coming up with a coercive approach, allow them in school. If you don't allow them, we shall do this, we shall do that. For me, that doesn't work. It's high time we identified such a group as a special needs group, and we identified a mechanism that handles them within their situation, than telling us to mix them with other students. Personally, in my school, I wouldn't allow that, I can assure you. But lastly, on the same, if they established that these kids cannot go back to school, assuming they did a perception or a survey, what else can we do? Schools have been, like my school has been more entrepreneurial in nature. that we have identified such kind of cases and we are now devising alternative education for these children, can we introduce them to fashion and design skills, to tailoring skills, to hairdressing, to agricultural skills, such as that in case they cannot, within that transition, in case they cannot go back into the mainstream form education, they have something to learn, they have something to show off, they have a skill they can sell for probably for self-employment or employability potential. Otherwise, by the trend of things, and of course that this works more in urban centers, but in the communities, these children are going to be married off immediately. Some of them are not willing to go back to school because they have not been counseled. Because it takes counseling to make sure that that child is kind of creates a motivation for him or her to go back to school. But before we leave that, there are also the boys. The boys have gone to quarries. The boys have gone to borders. The boys have gone to business. There's this hullabaloo about the girls, but how about the boys? The boy child has been neglected, and government is not coming up with a guideline to guide us on how we should treat such a boy child. One of them, I found him in a mechanic shop yesterday, and I was asking him, I will not mention his, do you feel like you want to go back to school? Yes, of course I would want, but my parent does not have fees. There are this and these other issues that are happening, and I deliberately told my mother, please allow this boy to go to school and at least finish primary 7, irrespective of his age. So there should be that one-on-one approaches with these children to ensure that we can counsel them on how they can appreciate these alternative processes of learning, to ensure that we can be working on at the same level. Thank you, Felix.
Wow, thank you very much, Eddie. Eddie is appropriate as well. So he's speaking from a bit of experience as someone who is running an education facility. And indeed, I think I agree with you when you say we should also consider equipping them with vocational skills. There's something you've touched, and it was my follow-up question. And I think let me throw this to Dr. Again, we're still discussing how prepared we are to address what Ed is calling the special needs category, because young mothers, pregnant young girls definitely fall in the special needs category for lack of another better word. But Ed, you raised something pertinent that for now the noise is about the pregnant young girls and the young mothers, but there are also boys who have become accidental fathers. They are now fathers, but they are boys and they are still in school. And how do you think government can best handle the boy child? Because the debate for now, like Eddie says, is shifting to girls. But there's the category of the boys who are also equally affected psychologically. They find themselves fathers when they are still boys. What should government do in this case? Doctor?
And preparedness to open the schools for such kinds of categories. And for me, it all comes as something that is, a little bit hurried, a little bit not well thought. As you're raising an important question, again, I've talked about the national guidelines for the prevention and management of teenage pregnancy. Even when you go to the guidelines, you see that question is not entirely well settled. They say, okay, if the responsible person is an adult, a teacher or what, they should face the law. But they are saying if the person who is responsible is a minor, then they should be counseled and they sign the commitments that they are going to take care of the girl that has become kind of pregnant. And the questions that linger in the mind, yes, there is need for the kind of counseling. What about if the parent prefers a defilement case? What are the other laws, talking about, issues of defilement, whether they are minors, whether they are seniors, and this kind of environment. So in the guidelines, there is attention, yes, to the boy child, but who is responsible for the pregnancy. And they said their parents should be called, they should also be cancelled, they should be enabled to accept the responsibility, there should be some kind of commitment here. Dealing with the psychological effect is something that is, quite difficult and quite problematic. One of the structure is to have, counseling kind of section or function within the schools, so that this is something that can be ongoing, something that can continue, moving forward. But this I think for me, this is still a very virgin area where we have to say, okay, there is a lot of focus on the girl child. In which ways are the boys affected, even when they are not necessarily responsible for the pregnancy? And we can even widen the debate. We are talking about the rights of the pregnant girls and breastfeeding mothers. What about the rights of those who are not pregnant to study in an polluted environment? Don't you think they are psychologically stressed when they are studying with their colleagues who are pregnant, who are carrying children? Have we thought about the right of those who are not pregnant to be in a conducive environment that enables them? Have we taken stock of the possible moral, emotional, and psychological effects? Imagine sharing a bed with someone who is breastfeeding and you are a 13-year-old girl. Do you think the environment is the same? So for me, even this whole talk about human rights is something that needs to be contextualized. And we look at the environment and create the environment, which is quite supportive. And that environment has not been put in place. And yet the ministry is combatively communicating schools should open. Like Eddie has said, I have seen head teachers who have stood their ground and said, we are not going to allow these children in school until such a time when we are ready, to handle them. And that's why I was saying, let's go back to our guidelines. You do not expect a 6-7 months pregnant to be either running to school on a day basis in the morning or being in the dormitory with kids who are not pregnant. We recognize the right, but the rights must be within a context and within environment. And we are looking at the broader, rights and contexts. And even those who are not pregnant, they should also, be thought about and be accorded the environment that is conducive for them to learn. So I think, to me, this should be work in progress. There is still need for more consultation. Consult with the head teachers, consult with the private education providers. There are other, intervening conflicts. In religion, premarital sex is a sin. Now, to a religious owner of a school, you want to allow a sinner, to come and mix with those who are not sinners. We are all sinners, but I'm talking about the psyche, about the spirituality, and about these considerations. How do you then accommodate other values, religious values, the moral values? You are talking about education standards. Norms and values are part of the standards. If you give a raw deal to the values, even education loses meaning, because education is about knowledge and skills and values, the attitudes and the change of the entire person. So we shouldn't, think about, the rights of the girl child, but let us look at what is education for, what is the environment for receiving education, how best can we deal with these kinds of cases. And as Eddie proposed, proactively there could be ways. If we stick to the guidelines, after 3 months, go out, do the antenatal care, deliver properly. After that, breastfeed at least for minimum 6 months. Maybe you are ready either to leave a kid at home with the maid and go back at lunch for breastfeeding. And then if we have not created that environment, for me, I say all these decisions and the talk and the threats by the ministry are just empty. They do not amount to anything. We have to create the environment and make sure that, kids are able to go to school and learn.
There you have it. You can be part of this conversation by sending in your question, comment on our Facebook page, also on our Twitter handle, and also on our YouTube account. It's very, very very open for you to just drop your thoughts and make this conversation more productive. Let's switch it a little bit to, and then we discuss the figures here. I was looking at the budget framework paper. I think about 6 trillion is being allocated, proposed to be allocated for the 2022-2023 financial year towards human capital development. You know, now we are running what we call a program-based budgeting system. So now within the human capital development, that's where you can locate the education sector. So when you look at the figures that are reflected in the proposed budget framework paper, which usually does not necessarily, I think from experience, I've been tracking usually BFPs, they don't necessarily differ so much from the final figures of the financial of the approved budgets. So I don't expect this figure to really change that much. But when you look at this proposal, what's your take in terms of whether this proposal reflects government's intent and desire to revamp a sector that has been in abeyance for the last 20 months? You have a sector that has not been operational. You need to see whether government is serious about it, even in the way it resources that sector. But what are your thoughts on these figures vis-a-vis the situation? I'll start with you, Eddie.
One, you should understand what is government appreciation of education as a key economic driver in the context of Uganda. When you get to the African setting, in the context of Africa, you and I know that education is one of the critical factors of human capital development. And when you are computing the Human Development Index, education comes in as a key function to determine whether a country should be developed or underdeveloped or emerging. Secondly, when you look at the quality of Uganda's education system, I was reading statistics from the World Bank yesterday, and they were mentioning that the productive capacity of a Ugandan child who has completed a set of education levels is 38%, meaning that within the system itself, at some point, the same person is wasted. There are very many years lost of productive education that would have improved the capacity of this person to deliver. Now, it goes back to using these statistics and information. How do you ensure that you use the budgets you have mentioned to structure an education system that follows the national education and development objectives? And for me, that is where our government goes wrong. When Doctor knows that we have the education white paper of Professor Kajubi, you recall learning about the same, that what government ought to have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago, up to now it has not done, and the paper still becomes relevant, that we should prioritize post-COVID-19, that COVID-19 has exposed us, COVID-19 has shattered the education sector, and therefore the monies we are getting should have been used to effectively plan, but also become efficiently used to ensure that there's value for education investment that brings return on investment. But what is being done, for example, when you go to monies that were supposed to be allocated to schools for inspection, monies that were supposed to be allocated to schools for infrastructure development, monies that were supposed to be given to the private sector educators to ensure that we at least reorganize ourselves to ensure that we open and operate well. Remember that the World Bank gave us money for COVID relief, part of which was supposed to go to education sector. In the budget 2022-2023 and the previous budget we are about to complete, they have given us money to ensure that the education sector operates and drives. But the mafiaism in the education sector, the same persons that have posh schools have deliberately ensured that we do not benefit from such kind of funds. When you go to the ministries and departments and agencies, probably this money has been dispersed. But you go to any school within a private sector setting and ask where they have received any money, what they will tell you. Just recently, we schools in the private sector, they told us, you know, we have devised means to ensure that your teachers who are not on payroll, government payroll, remember that government teachers have been drawing money from salaries in their banks. For us, we have not been getting money. We are organizing the means of gender and labor and social development to ensure that before the schools open, we are going to give you some COVID relief money. None of those teachers has received money. We have given our names to the ministry and all has gone to waste. These are money that were supposed to be given to us for ensure that we, as key stakeholders in the education sector and people who support the education sector, we do something better for the nation. And remember that we in the in the private sector institutions, a school is not is not a profit-making venture. It is a social service. So it is incumbent upon the government to ensure that they support us in any way. But they have disappointed us. We are actually asking, is it worth it for us to invest our money into the education sector when the government that we are supporting is just sitting on and looking on like it is not bothered? So, Felix, it goes back to our institutional structures in the Ministry of Education, presided over by our grandmother, grandfather. Secondly, a sector that is not functional, a sector that is relegating our country children unproductive, a sector that is presided over by a mafia. I mean, I lack the best words to describe this. I don't think Ugandans are happy about this, and there should be a national apology from the sector, from the Ministry of Education, towards what they have done for the education system in Uganda. And I don't think that investment you're talking about, of the billions you're talking about, is ever going to be productive if at all we are not consulted and if the stakeholders are not put in context to ensure that we support government on realizing that. We shall have the usual corruption that we have had. Thank you, Felix.
Okay, let me come to you, Doctor. Pick it up from there in terms of when you look at what government is allocating to the sector, does this reflect a government that is really prioritizing education? Given the 20 months the sector has been in abeyance, but also in there you can also discuss, I know there was money that was meant to support government-aided schools to prepare themselves for reopening. Many of them have not received this money. So what does this speak about government in terms of prioritizing education as a sector?
I want to take it back to the basics, and then we pick it from there and we see how to make sense out of the basics. We have a national development plan, which is the master plan and which is the guide for the allocation of budgets and priorities. And the National Development Plan 3, if credit must be given, is a very elaborate kind of document with very clear performance indicators, with clear goals, and with clear resources. And if we were to, adhere to that, and of course, it is even the framework against which we hold the government accountable on whether things are being done properly or not properly. As you've noted, you've talked about, the budget framework papers. I think it is this week ending and the previous week when the budget, the committees of parliament have been scrutinizing these budget framework papers. And by the way, in the budget planning, in the budgeting, in the planning of the financial year, it is at this stage where the priorities that are going to be budgeted and funded should be, set and decided upon. Sometimes I laugh at people who wait for a week to the reading of the budget and they want to demonstrate and show that the priorities were not captured. We have a clear budget process, and as you've rightly said, it is at this level of framework papers that priorities are captured, which are going to inform the budget. Unfortunately, I haven't read, the budget framework paper for the education sector. I think we need to, if it is accessible to the public, to have a look at it and see beyond the money which is allocated, what are the kind of priorities that have been earmarked. Schools have different needs. There are schools with structures, with laboratories, with electricity. Do we see the Minister of Education shifting the priority and saying, okay, for the schools which have the kind of capacity, we shall do the normal things of paying the salaries and what, but much of the budget sector is going to the schools that we were talking about at the beginning, either putting classroom blocks or putting laboratories or employing more teachers, or continuing with the COVID operating procedures. So I think to answer your question comfortably, I need to look at what are the kind of priorities that the Ministry of Education is putting in its framework paper beyond the amount that has been assigned to it, and look at how those priorities are reflecting the post-COVID situation. Because post-COVID is going to be a situation of reconstruction, whether it is the economy, whether it is business, whether it is school, every sector, we are in the reconstruction. Now, how are we prioritizing the recruitment of teachers to fit the deficit? Many teachers have left. They are in computers, they are doing other businesses, and we have seen many of them. So I want to see how, however small it is, I want to know what is the percentage of the entire budget. But however small it is, what are the priorities? Does it reflect the post-COVID kind of reconstruction and re-emerging of education sector, or it is business as usual? If it is business as usual, the problems are going to become more complex, and we mean the future is going to even be more bleak 2-3 years moving forward. So we need to realign the priorities, whether it is the economy, whether it is health, whether it is education, to how do we get ourselves out of the distraction that has been caused by COVID and getting back ourselves on the right feet. And as it is said, for me, priority should be given to where there is more need. The kind of affirmative budgeting. We need affirmative budgeting. Yes, it is the sector, it is Ministry of Education, but there are schools which are in a terrible state. There are priorities that should be given. And by the way, okay, finally, this is not part of the question. We know recently we have been discussing the question of salaries for science teachers. You understand? And now we should be going back and see how are the schools able to carry themselves forward after reconstruction. What kind of science do we need in school? Have we done proper curriculum review and proper orientation of teachers? Ed talked about teachers' inability even to implement the abridged curriculum. And you see, this is where the mistakes have been made. You talked about planning. And for me, we have had a long-standing problem with the Ministry of Education for a long time. Ed talked about the Kajubi Commission and the 1991 white paper, which we never implemented. In 1997, out of a presidential directive, we started UPE, without proper planning, without involvement of the technocrats. UPE has had its own achievements, but overall it has been a mess. It has had its own achievements and it's okay. You understand? So we don't seem to learn from the past. How are we allowing the technocrats, the experts in education, to do proper planning so that then we can be able, to pull ourselves from this kind of mess? Yes, I was talking about UPE because when people talk about UPE as one of the best achievements of NRM government, you look at the enrollment and completion rates. We have stagnated between 38 and 42 completion rates since 1997. Would you rate your kid who is not hitting the average of 50 to be one of the best? Our overall education system in primary, it has stagnated between 48 and 52. Countries like Kenya are doing 85, completion rates. And yet the first objective of UPE is to make sure that all children of school-going age go to school, remain in school until they complete. Now, first of all, the enrollment rate does not cater for all of them. Those who enroll, less than 50% complete. And we are here singing. If we do not handle the post-COVID situation, these statistics are going to be even worse. And that is the point I'm ending with.
All right, thank you. Indeed. What a way of ending this show. Our time is fast spent. There was a question about the commercialized nature in which our education system is at the moment but I think I will defer that for the next discussion. I promise we shall come back to have a part 2 of this debate because it's top of the hour. But as I sign out, let me read a couple of comments that came through. Ikalino said that the government doesn't prioritize education sector. In his village, classrooms are full and people are studying under the trees. And then there was another comment from, I think, Henry, who said that a country whose young population is denied education can never realize its potential. And then Esero lastly was referring to us the 72 billion, which has been allocated to community mobilization and mindset change, and which is too little for the situation we are in that requires a lot of counseling and mindset change about encouraging learners to go back to school. Thank you so much. It's a minute past the top of the hour. I was with Dr. Denis Musinguzi, a senior lecturer at Uganda Martyrs University, and Eddie Kayinda, and a researcher and a public admin and management expert and economist. We were discussing whether the situation of concerning the deficits in Uganda's education sector, is it a case of poor planning? And I have been your host, Felix Kafuma. Thank you for being part of this conversation and discussion. Till next week, bye-bye. Stay safe. Be blessed. Nice week.